I'm really pleased today to be able to introduce my friend, Arthur Horwitz. Arthur Horwitz, and of course, we're going to go over his book. I think that's the main reason we're here. But Arthur is publisher emeritus of the Detroit Jewish News. He was publisher for 36 years there and has nearly 50 years as a journalist, 50 years of being a journalist, I should say. He has degrees from the University of Connecticut and Yale. And he did his career the old-fashioned way. He began a long time ago as a copy boy trainee. And this is the lowest rung, I think, of the journalistic ladder. But over the years, he was a reporter, bureau chief, manager, and at the New Haven Register and the Baltimore Sun. And I like the way he describes himself. He's a journalist who is Jewish and a Jewish journalist, and there is a distinction. He's also been heavily involved in civic affairs in Michigan. For two examples, chairing the board of Detroit Public Television and chairing the board or herding the board for the Michigan Civil Rights Commission. And he was inducted into the Journalism Hall of Fame in 2020. No small feat. And a personal story, where it ends up being a personal story, is in 2002, the Jewish News burned to the ground. But one thing that was saved were the back copies of the Detroit Jewish News. Sooty, dirty, but they were saved, and that's when our relationship began. Because Arthur, that was in 2002. In 2013, he fulfilled his quest of digitizing every historic copy of the Detroit Jewish News. 2015, every copy of its predecessor, the Detroit Jewish Chronicle. It's now one of the best, if not the best, Jewish English language newspaper databases in the country. So much so that the National Library of Israel requested a copy and is our backup. And so he also has shrewd judgment because he hired me as archivist, which I thought was a good move. And now you know, if you don't like what I do and you have any complaints, here's the guy to talk to, right here. Anyway, I'm really happy to introduce Arthur. And we'll talk about his book, Dueling Identities, in Meier's Shadow.
Great.
So,
well, let me just...
Yeah, thank you.
Well, before Mike gets into the questions, first and foremost, thank you, because many of the things that Mike mentioned wouldn't have happened, wouldn't have been possible without his coaching, his guidance, his persistence. Pam, persistence, is that a good word for your husband? Yes, absolutely. So I owe a lot to Mike, including early on for pushing me, coaxing me, cajoling me to do the book that actually many of you have in your hands, and hopefully more of you would. So I would thank Mike right out of the gate. And also just to see so many friends and people I haven't seen in a while, colleagues, former colleagues from the Jewish News. So looking forward to sharing a little bit more about the book, about maybe a little bit of the background of the book, but again, and of course, thanks to Schuler Books for making this possible.
Well, thanks, Arthur. I got $100 for you after the show.
I thought it was 500, but okay.
So we're going to start at the beginning, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Arthur grew up in what might be a classic Jewish, old-school Jewish neighborhood in New Haven. And so I thought maybe you might speak about your roots in that sense. It's much different than the Detroit experience.
Sure. Anywhere else but in Michigan, I would have to say, I wouldn't have to respond to that in a slightly different way to start. He's not talking about New Haven and Macomb County and the traditional Jewish community there, though I think there were people from New Haven Colony back in the day who came to the Northwest Territories and probably said, well, why don't we just create New Haven like we had back home? But really for me, my upbringing was very much tied in to a geographic area in New Haven called Oak Street in Legion Avenue. By the time I was 4 or 5, 6 years old, they had already knocked down a lot of the Oak Street area. That's where the Jews settled turn of the century. There were also Italian immigrants and others. And there's similar stories like we have here in Detroit, where redevelopment, highways kind of took out in mass areas that were kind of run down. And that part of New Haven was run down. It also happened to have been very close to where Yale's campus was and is. And Yale, is a tax-exempt property, holder, and they gobbled up a lot of that property for their own purposes. So there's a thread in the book of this town-gown Yale-New Haven dynamic that comes from that. But really, there was another area a little further away called Legion Avenue. And that's really where, my grandfather, because see, my mother was a survivor, and we'll talk about that in a moment or two. My father was born in New Haven, Connecticut. He barely left New Haven, Connecticut. So I was rooted in the areas where he grew up. His father had a little clothing store. I would go there and sell buttons. Maybe I ended up, a precursor for selling ads or sponsorships or God knows what. But, I would hawk buttons door to door and watch my grandfather always handle or negotiate price on his dungarees or smocks or snuggies or other things that they had in their store. So that was kind of the traditional background. Into that background, there were kosher bakeries, et cetera. My mother, as a Holocaust survivor, came to New Haven in 1949, and she couldn't come here unless there were sponsors for her, including having a job. So she had a job at a kosher bakery. She could barely speak English, but probably better at it than most Holocaust survivors. The bakery was 2 doors down from where my father had his clothing store. He was 27 and single. She was probably by then 21 and definitely single. And after a short courtship, they were married. So that neighborhood kind of brought together the old world, that kind of early world that I was part of, and the world that my mother, after being uprooted and losing everything, was thrust into or placed into. And subsequently, when we moved to another location, which was closer to where Yale had its athletic facilities, the neighborhood area there was more mixed. There were still Jewish families there, but it was really those roots, Mike, that kind of are the underpinning of how the story is built out from those connections from that time and that era.
Okay. Before we start getting into the essentials of the book, I think maybe we'd like to know, how did you end up in Detroit? Because you've been here now for 40-odd years.
Yeah, very odd years. Most of them, not all of them. If you had asked me in 1985 or thereabouts, if I ever thought I would be in Detroit, I would say, what are you talking about? At the time, I was at the Baltimore Sun. I was working there on the business side, happy with what I was doing. And I was on a committee of the Associated Jewish Charities and Welfare Fund, which was their equivalent of their federation. And it was a committee because they had a demographic study. And part of what I did was research for the Baltimore Sun, marketing research, planning, et cetera. And there was another man there who everybody noticed when he walked in the door late. And his name was Chuck Berger. And Chuck Berger had bought the Detroit Jewish News in 1984. So this was maybe a year and a half after he bought the Jewish News. And he and Gary Rosenblatt, who had just been a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize, by the way, so hang on that one, a Jewish newspaper is a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize, wanted to make Detroit as good as it can be, and it already had a good foundation, and God knows, as we see here, a good community. So he came up to me after a meeting, and he said, I'd love to have lunch with you. I'd love to have you come and see my offices. That's it. He didn't say, I want you to go to Detroit, So I had a nice lunch. He had a companion with him, a Tanqueray on the rocks with a twist, which was always his companion, not just me and others. And right next door were these brownstones that were kind of combined that were the Baltimore Jewish Times offices. I go in, he gives me a quick tour. I go to the lower level, and there were a bunch of people, maybe 7 or so, in a conference room. Knocks on the door, knock, knock, and says, "Hi, I'd like to introduce you to Arthur Horwitz." And I look in, I don't know who the hell these people are. I go, "Oh, hi, and, let's continue the tour." And then there was one person, and some people, Cy would probably remember Sylvia Stafford, and a couple other folks who go back. And Sylvia looks at me and says, "So why do you want to go to Detroit?" And I said, "Well, up until this moment, I didn't know I did." At any rate, Chuck was trying to lure me. I was 31 at the time, to come to Detroit to be responsible for the daily operations, to try to make it as good, and I think people here would agree eventually better. Right, Carrie? Right? Better than Baltimore. I wasn't, and as Mike said, at that time, I was a journalist who happened to be Jewish. And to go to the Detroit Jewish News, if I even wanted to, I'd have to think about what it meant to be a Jewish journalist. Because there's this whole thing about objectivity and impartiality that presumably journalists bring to their work. And if you are a journalist who happens to be Jewish, then you at least think that you can do that. We all know we all have our biases, and they influence everything we do. As a Jewish journalist, I realized that, I'm an advocate. This is an advocacy publication, the Jewish News. However, what it does is it advocates for the survival of the Jewish people. There are lots of ways, as we know, and opinions of how to do that. Right wing, left wing, Zionist, non-Zionist, this, that, the other thing. That's what a Jewish journalist is. But I still, Detroit and the Jewish newspaper, I don't know. He said, "Why don't you come out for a visit?" Come out for a visit, do the classic tour, which is you avoid, at the time, the city of Detroit. He picked me up from the airport, took me up, Northwestern Highway. And I never seen anything like that in Baltimore. Here's, Sunset Strip, and here's, all these Maury Margolis properties and these other strip malls all over the place, et cetera. And then he takes me out to Somerset, and it's like, oh my God, and I called Gina and I said, "Gee, there's something here." But of course, I wasn't going to come here or think about coming here and say, "Oh, by the way, honey, should I head for the hills because I made this decision for us?" We don't do that in our house. So Gina comes out. You know what November in Michigan, Detroit kind of feels like, looks like? Yeah, it was November of 1985. It was gray, and it was about 45 degrees, and we're driving on Interstate 94. And we're heading to Southfield, to the office we had, which was on Civic Center Drive at the time. Suite 240, Civic Center Drive, okay? And Chuck's very worried because Gina, who many of you know, always has a smile, or almost always has a smile on her face. And she was, I don't want to say scowling, but she wasn't quite smiling. And then we're driving, and she says suddenly, "It's a sign. It's a sign." So we're on 94, and I look to my right, and immediately I see like a wall-side window billboard, and probably their offices. And then I see a 1-800-CALL-SAM sign. I said, "What sign are you talking about, Gina?" She said, "That one." And it was the tire, the U.S. rubber tire. And she said, "It's a sign. I rode on that in the 1964 World's Fair in Flushing." Well, for any of you who were on the East Coast and went to the World's Fair, there was a Ferris wheel, and there it was in Allen Park, right there. And of course, after that, everyone's smiling and laughing, and here we are 40 years later, and, we still haven't, gone out and had our picture taken with the upgraded and improved look of that tire over the years. But needless to say, when we do drive by it, it's kind of like, do you remember your first time? And that tire is kind of the clincher for why we came to Detroit.
If you grew up in Detroit, I would still argue Sam Bernstein would be the sign for Jewish Detroit, or the commercials on TV.
Bada boom.
Yeah. So I want to get into the book now. I'm not sure which order I should ask these. One, I want to ask, why did you write the book? But also, before maybe we ask that question, tell us about dual identities. What does dual identities mean? Because one thing I've noticed, that every review, including my own, had a little bit different take on your dual identities, and I think we need to hear from the author on this.
Yeah, well, the book that you have did not start out that way. The book that I was initially thinking about, and again, it was right at the beginning of COVID, so my guess is there are others in this room who probably were saying, well, I have a little time on my hands. And also right after the Jewish News became a nonprofit and I was able to step back. So it started out as not a memoir. It started out as kind of looking at that New Haven-Yale dynamic that I referenced at the beginning, and and more of like almost like a footnoted history type view from somebody who lived on both sides of the locked gates and barbed wire fences that Yale had that separated many of its facilities from the native folk, of which I was kind of among the native folk. And then I realized that there were really multiple identities, dueling identities. So I started to kind of, try to, shake those out. There was the dual identity of being the child of one Holocaust survivor parent and one American-born parent. That's a dueling identity, if you will. There's that New Haven and Yale component that was a dueling identity. Because in my house, no matter what Yale did, and it did things that weren't so good to New Haven and New Haveners over the centuries, not just over a few decades. In my household, especially because of my father, you can never hate Yale. You can be disappointed in Yale, but you can never hate Yale. So there was that dueling identity, if you will. And then there was a dueling identity of a journalist and a Jewish journalist. So there were these kind of multiple dueling identities, but the one that was at the core was the one I had with my mother's little brother, Meier, who I'm named for. Arthur Meier and his Avram Meier, named for her little brother, who was 6 when the Holocaust hit Poland, or reached Poland, or what became known as the Holocaust, and who was killed. So there was that dual identity there. And again, with Mike's help, some others as well, but Mike was really helpful in essentially saying you have to drill down what's the core, what's the essence of that dual or dueling identity. And it was having to live 2 lives. Mine and the one my mother's little brother never had. And my mother, in order to survive, lived in worlds of reality and fantasy. Because to survive, she had to imagine like this reunion after whatever was happening with her family and the apple of her eye, her little brother. And that helped her get up every morning, no matter how sick she was or how broken down she was, because that was like her dream. And of course, when the war ended, she found out that her little brother, and she could still name like 91 family members decades later who didn't survive, 6 who did, by the way. So she put on me that responsibility for living that life. And that really became the theme, that thread that carried through. But the ultimate image that carried through is there's a photo, an iconic photo of a little boy surrendering to a German while the Warsaw Ghetto is being demolished behind him, if you will. And it's the little boy with his arms up. You probably all have seen it or are familiar with it. And my mother carried that photo in her wallet, fantasy and reality. And when I came across it when I was about 12 years old, when I was looking for money, I wasn't always the perfect angel you all know me to be, at least back at that age. I challenged her. I said, "Who's this?" And she said, "Well, that's my little brother. That's who you're named for. That's Meier." And I said, "No, it's not," because I already knew, even at that age, that that was an iconic Holocaust photo. She insisted it was, and when we had the back and forth, she kind of decided from that moment forward that I would live both lives And that would really shape my life, my family, and my media career as well.
Oh, okay. Well, tell us more about your mother and your mother's experience.
Sure,
and
sure.
the impact on you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, my mother was born in 1928 in a little community called Zwollin, which was near Rodom in Poland. Parents, four siblings, probably a typical Jewish family at the time. Zwollin was maybe 40% Jewish, about 10,000 people. War starts September 1, September 3rd. The Wehrmacht kind of moves in after the dive bombers do their thing. They separate the men and the boys, Jewish men and boys from the Jewish women and girls. That's when her father takes her little brother. They go into hiding, and that was it for them. They were kind of outed and killed, as it turned out, when she found out. So she spent a few years in service to the Germans, digging ditches, peeling potatoes, doing backbreaking work. And then in about October of 1942, everything changed. The bells on their church rang in their town square. The Jews of Zwollin were rounded up, forced to march about 9 miles to a railroad siding. And at that railroad siding, there were already several thousand other Jews from other parts of the Rodom district. And there's a theme that runs through this for me, and I suspect, as I look around and I see other children of survivors here, and it's called luck. There were multiple times where, of course, I wasn't even born yet, where I won the lottery. One of the most significant times is among those thousands of people. There was a German who picked out 15 young girls. And he points to my mother as one of those 15. And my mother remembers her mother pushing her older sister out. And the last words that my mother ever heard her own mother say, of course she never knew it would be the last words, were in Yiddish, and it translates loosely to, she was telling my mother's older sister, you need to go with her because she'll need somebody to help her wash her hair. So if you think about all the profound things you could say if you knew those would be your last words, and the German had plenty of other girls to choose from, so he took a 16th, my mother's sister. They were separated out. They went to a farm to harvest potatoes, and that night all the others there, including my mother's parents, her grandmother, cousins, another sister, were loaded on trains that ended up going to Treblinka. So that's what happened. Afterwards, luck again, lottery again. My mother was picked, this time to go to a German run now munitions factory. It had been a Polish munitions factory in a place called Skarżysko. And she ended up there in an area where she was quality control for bullets. They also made mortar shells there, et cetera, et cetera. When the Russians were coming, the Red Army, they moved them to another, Hasag was the name of the German industrial company that ran the factory, to another factory that they were making bullets, and that's when she was liberated, January 15th, 1945. By the way, it turned out to be my father's birthday. She hadn't met him yet. And we always celebrated Martin Luther King's birthday because it was Martin Luther King's birthday. So we always had that growing up later. She goes to a displaced persons camp after going home looking for her family and was chased out of her hometown under the threat of death from the non-Jewish natives who were there, if you will. And she ended up in the place where you knew you had to go, which was the American zone of occupation in Germany, because they knew you go where the Americans are, because the Americans aren't going to kill you, they're not going to abuse you, they may not be able to help you the way you need to, but you go where the Americans are. And when I speak to middle school and high school kids, I always emphasize how important that was. You go where you are. You go where the Americans are. They found a family who would sponsor her in New Haven, Connecticut. One of the people she was with had an aunt there, and that's how she ended up in New Haven. And you heard about how she met my dad. And later on, I came along.
I was intrigued in the book about some of your stories about how you pieced together your mom's Holocaust experience by listening, hiding, listening through walls, so to speak, listening to her and her friends chat. Maybe address that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think every child is a little different. I was always a bit curious. The Yiddish word that I remember, one of the many Yiddish words that I thought described who I was, I even thought it was part of my name, was bandit. When I got a little older, it was chutzpahnik, and a little bit of Uganifew or whatever, okay, especially when I took the money out of my mother's wallet, or tried to. But what I found is, see, my mother always wanted to be more American. A lot of the survivors wouldn't talk. They stayed with each other, and, they played cards. They always played cards. My mother wanted to be more American. She went out of her way to have American friends, most of them not Jewish, by the way. It was a way for her to practice her English. She wanted to learn mahjong. She didn't want to play cards, okay? She wanted to do current events. She wanted a little later to, talk about Jackie Kennedy's size 10 shoes because my mother had size 10 feet or whatever, etc. So she talked. That's the main thing. And the friends listened. And when I was young, I would hide in a bathtub behind the shower curtain in a closet. I was curious. I listened. But the stuff I heard, you shouldn't hear. Certainly at that age, I was probably 5 or 6 or 4 even at various times, because even though her English was accented, I could certainly decipher what she was saying. And there are things that I shouldn't have been hearing. And there was nobody in the room or around the kitchen table who they were so mesmerized that they didn't say, gee, Sally, do you think maybe you have a child here somewhere in the house? Maybe you shouldn't be talking that way. So I call it the secondhand smoke. And it wasn't just the Winstons and Marlboros, and Parliaments that they were smoking, but I was inhaling their stories, and I became addicted to them, if you will. And they were always something that stayed with me. So I guess you can say, part of why I maybe was destined to be a journalist is because I was curious. I like to listen to people, to hear their stories, even stories at a very young age that I shouldn't have heard. And that, continues. I can still hear and see those people and figuratively smell that smoke. Certainly literally from the cigarettes, but figuratively from what were they thinking and how did I deal with it. And part of how I dealt with it was I acted out, a la bandit, ganif, chutzpahnik, etc.
How does this affect your journalism? Or how did it affect it?
I think it comes down to listening. Everybody has a story. I think that's one of the things that was a takeaway. My mother had her unique story, but really thinking back, every survivor had his or her unique story. Those who didn't make it, millions of them, 6 million, would have had their own stories, but everybody's got a story. And I think as a journalist, that curiosity, how do you let people, or hopefully help people feel comfortable enough to share parts of their story that not only makes them feel good or maybe better, but that somehow improves or betters those who would read the story, maybe give them some extra oomph, extra encouragement for something, etc. So that was, my brother was a scientist and a mathematician and a physics whiz and all of that. He was not the one, eavesdropping. He was diagramming extension cords as a kid, and kind of making up his own plugs and how they would connect, Rube Goldberg style, if you know what I mean. So that isn't the mind typically of a writer or a journalist.
So, excuse me. So why write the book? Why did you, besides you were retired, need something to do, why write the book? What was your motivation for this?
One of the things that I was noticing or starting to notice is that children of survivors i.e. myself, are very good at writing books about their parents. They write about their parents. Or, gee, I went back to Ukraine or Poland and I discovered my father had a family before my family and I never learned about it. Or, there's always seems to be, and I say this with respect, the shoemaker of Auschwitz or the dressmaker of Auschwitz, or the athlete of Auschwitz or the whatever. But there was always this writing by children of survivors about their parents. And when I started to say, well, I don't see much written by children of survivors about what it was like growing up in post-World War II America as children of survivors. There's very little out there. And I recognized at that point that, and that also helped kind of funnel my thinking when I had mentioned earlier, is this going to be like a New Haven-Yale dynamic, or are there all these different dueling identities that space needed filling? And in writing the book, I was really hoping for a couple of things. One is it would respectfully fill that space, because most children of survivors don't go there because, they don't want to hurt their parents if it comes to that. Or they view their parents as heroes, all of them. And my experience has been survivors, most of them were heroic, but only a handful were true heroes. The guy who led the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, Angelovich or whatever, that's a hero. So if we can separate heroic from heroes, then our parents are just human like everybody else. And how can we share those stories and how they influenced who we are and what we do and what kind of decisions we as children really have made in our lives. So that, to me, opened up that category. But the other thing is children of survivors, the oldest among us are entering our 9th decade. They were born like in 1946 in displaced persons camp. Nobody's asking us about our stories. Our children, 3Gs, are interested in our grandparents. Many knew our parents, their grandparents. But they don't ask their own parents what happened. And one of the things I hope from this mic is that maybe the grandchildren will take the lead in capturing the stories. For an earlier generation, it was through video testimonies about what happened, so we don't lose that generation, my generation, in that link of kind of reinforcement of fact, of truth, of what happened to our parents.
Mm-hmm. Besides being a superb book in and of itself, I will tell you, if you haven't read it yet, this is also cutting edge, because what you just discussed, there's a very thin literature out there right now, though it's growing, and yours adds to it, of the experience of children of Holocaust survivors. And it's like it's just been discovered within the last 5 to 10 years, this topic. Well, I want to end with 2 other things. Going back to your journalistic career, what was one thing, your journalistic career, you had a little bit of a problem with obits at one time. Could you tell us about that?
Obits, eh? Well,
I'm going
to take. Leave it at that. Leave it at that. Okay. I had breakfast with Mike a few days ago. We like to catch up anyway. Pam, he really does have breakfast with me. He's not like running off to some whatever in Mount Clemens or who knows what salt baths or whatever else. You know what? And we kind of had a little bit of a conversation that related to to what happened with the obits. Well, in 1984, when the Baltimore crew came, one of the first things they did, because that was the Baltimore way, is the obituaries in the Detroit Jewish News ran in the middle of the Baltimore Jewish Times. And you see here at the Detroit Jewish News, the obituaries were at the back of the paper. okay? Or, as I like to say, it was really our front page, because we read from right to left. You know, I mean, there aren't too many communities that read from right to left, so it was really our front page or inside front page, etc. So in their wisdom, the Baltimore people moved it. And I'm thinking about, like, was it the 10th plague in the Passover story? And there was a cry from throughout the land, a cry never heard before in the annals of the Detroit Jewish News. And the common people, the readers, the subscribers, had an uprising. And as Mike found out, there was an Eat Crow apology in the Jewish News, maybe a few weeks later after that happened, basically saying, we heard you, we're sorry, we're going to put the obits back where you like them, at the front of the book, right to left, etc. And so they stayed there. Now, must have been 15 years ago. I was at an event at Shir Shalom. Maybe it was a men's club. There was a man named George Lakin. I don't know if some of you knew George. It was Zeke Lakin. Many of you may have known Zeke. This was his son. And George is at Shir Shalom. He's sitting next to me, and I present, and I lean over to him, and I said to him, I bet the first question I get will be, why did you move the obituaries? And he looks at me, and he says, come on. And then, and then George says, are there, any questions? And their hands are shooting up. I mean, just, hands, 10 hands maybe. There maybe 50, similar sized crowd, maybe even a little larger. And he goes like this. You. Remember when you moved the obituaries? So I think it may be a generational thing, and maybe Jackie or Carrie, you would know if people still kind of, hark back to, do you remember when you moved the obituaries and we triumphed, and there should be a national, local holiday once a year, kind of like Patriots Day or right, instead of running a marathon, that's when we, the crown of King Chuck, was taken off of his head, and we moved the obituaries back.
Personally, I benefit from this. The compliment I've received a number of times is, you're the second thing I read in the Jewish News. That's because my column comes right after the obituaries.
Oh, by the way, obituaries was the most popular thing in the paper, even more popular than Danny Raskin.
So before we open up for questions, not to dwell on your personal traumas, Arthur, but I think there's one, the baseball story you should tell us, and then we'll open up for questions.
Okay. See, I've got kind of a chuckle meter in front of me in Michael Hermanoff, so let's see if I can get his chuckle meter going. Oh, there we go. I didn't have to do anything, did I? just said that. So
He started already.
You made it easy for me. All right. Well, you see, I like to play baseball, and I was probably 13. I qualified for Babe Ruth League Baseball. I don't know if, Babe Ruth League Baseball, 13-year-old stuff, right? Okay. And it was a Saturday morning, and it was registration. Babe Ruth League, by the way, was 13 to 15 years old, so it was like my first, registration. It was a Saturday morning. My father went to Shul every Saturday, drove, parked about a block away from the Orthodox Shul, walked. The gabbai would say, "New Mr. Horwitz, you find a good parking spot," that kind of thing, right? Okay. So he says, I said, "I need a birth certificate, Dad. I've got to go." And he can't find it. And he gives me an envelope. He says, "Take this. It'll do." And I hop on my bicycle, and I have my envelope, I have my glove, and, I didn't take a bat or whatever, and I'm pedaling. It was probably 3 miles away to a field, but it felt like 20 miles away. And I get there, I'm a little bit late, and there are lines. Some of you who've ever registered for anything, really, certainly sports, you have these lines. And the people who are working behind the table, it's like Ralph Civitello and, Vinny Canada. I mean, these are the folks who are working behind. They're fine, nice people, they care about baseball. I finally get to the front of the line, and, do you have your birth certificate, son? And I give him the envelope, and he opens the envelope, and he looks at it, scratches his head, and he walks to where a couple of the other, I'll call them in New Haven, we called the New Haven Italian natives paisans, where his other friends were. And they're scratching their heads, and meanwhile the line has stopped. All the lines have stopped. It felt like I had 100 pairs of eyes on me, which I probably did. And then these guys that's your cue, start chuckling and guffawing almost. And they come, and Ralph Civitello, still remember, may he rest in peace, I'm sure, came back and he said, with a big smile on his face, "Son, this'll do." And I said, "What the hell is this?" And I opened the envelope, and it was my circumcision certificate. And I got home after, and my father was home from shul, and aside from a very significant confrontation with my father, I suspect what I said to him was something along the lines of this: I don't think Hank Greenberg and Sandy Koufax had to show their circumcision papers when they wanted to play ball.
Excellent. So, questions?
Yeah, I'm Joe Meier. We just showed a movie that was in the Jewish news too, which is really wonderful, on the Holocaust, which is really great. And I would like to know if Art is interested in making a movie, maybe go to Warner Brothers with your book.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wow, if you know any good producers or funders, or I don't know, does Mickey Shapiro do movies these days, or somebody like that? Thanks, Joe. Appreciate that.
Anybody else?
David Fleischer over here.
Art, did you have any siblings? And if you did, how did your mother being in the Holocaust affect them?
Great question. Did you hear that question? Did I have siblings? I had an older brother, younger sister. And one of the interesting things, Dave, that came out of writing the book was us comparing notes. And my brother saying, I didn't realize that Mom had put the weight of responsibility on your shoulders for living her brother's life, because she put her own personal weight on living her life on my shoulders, i.e. my brother, okay? And my sister, who's the youngest of us, basically said, I want nothing to do with anything going on here, and kind of, as early as she could, tried to be out of the house, away from the dynamics. But I think one of the things, and it probably goes on not just in a house where you have Holocaust survivor parents, or parent in my case, my father, American born, is that everybody has his or her own story within the same household. And I also had it with cousins. So I had first cousins, some who lived in New Haven. My mother's sister ended up in New Haven as well, one of her sisters. And we compared notes after the book came out. And what I found, and I think it ties into why it's so important for children of survivors to write their stories, my cousins were opening up to me about things that they had never talked about, would never talk about. But perhaps just one final notation, I mentioned early on that my mother was willing to talk about the Holocaust. Many survivors wouldn't or couldn't or don't. And for my mother, she said, I feared the silence more than the talking about the Holocaust, because in the silence I could see the faces of my family, my friends, whatever. So being in a household where I had somebody who talked about it, was willing to talk about it to strangers, I think influenced all of us. But again, like I had mentioned earlier, my brother was in his own bubble. He said it. I was too busy memorizing the Arrow Street Guide, or like my grandson who memorized the Ann Arbor Transit Authority bus routes at age 6 or whatever. That was kind of my brother. So you have those dynamics at play, but it all comes together ultimately where, children of survivors all have his or her or their own stories.
Was this cousin the daughter of the hair washer?
No, that's a good question, Anita. My mother survived because, in part, she had two sisters who were with her almost the whole time. One ended up in St. Louis because there was a sponsor for her and her husband at that time, because a lot of folks married in the displaced persons camp after the war. So she ended up in St. Louis, but my mother had and that's the one who was telling her about washing the hair. The one who ended up in New Haven was an older sister, and they also, and they would tell you if they were here, they made sure that the other one answered the bell every day, and that helped keep them alive.
Back there?
Oh, hi. I'm just Andrew. I teach psychology, and one of the things that strikes me about this dual identities or dueling identities, there are those of us who are the middle children of history, and then there are many people who are part of society as it changes, and some aspect of one's youth, one's identity, one's sense of self is something that they do feel they have from the world. And I guess one question I have for the next generation, is there something that this book or that you can teach the next generation about how to grapple or cope with those aspects of ourselves that we're just not sure how to talk about?
Spoken like a true academic. Thanks, Pontius. I appreciate that very much.
Stand away from the speaker.
Yeah, please.
So
yeah.
let me, I don't know that I can give you a concise answer, but that's my fourth generation that you hear right now. And my daughter Stephanie, who's here, is somebody who's been very active and engaged as a 3G, as they call them, a third generation survivor, in both understanding more, not just my mother's kind of story, but also the stories that we as second generation, as children of survivors have. We were at an event that she sponsored not long ago. There's a group that basically, right before Yom HaShoah in April, it started out of Israel, and they have these parlor meetings that really are all over the world where survivors or children of survivors or others are brought together. And she hosted one at her home. She had done it 3 times when she was living in Israel, continued it, and that's the daughter right here, when she came here. And we were in conversation, father and daughter, after I presented a little bit. And after we had the conversation, she was teary-eyed and said, "I'm sorry, Dad, that I never asked you about what it was like about living in the household, the kinds of things that you had that you didn't express, couldn't express for decades." I mean, don't forget, this is, a lot of the things that happened to me were 65 years ago that the book ultimately allowed me to share or release. So I think it still comes down to how do you be sure you ask questions, be curious, tell your stories, and for the next generation and the fourth generation someday in Sylvie, that we can keep asking questions, that the stories that are there can be reapplied to what's going on in the world today. And how do we learn from those lessons? One of the last things that I do when I present to children, middle school, high school children, at the Holocaust Center, is I close with a person named Gogatz. Gogatz was a Polish supervisor under the direction of the Germans who oversaw my mother. My mother was a little like me. She got into trouble, except when she got into trouble, a German put a rifle to her head, and as he was about to blow her brains out, had her turn around, Gogatz intervened. Gogatz could have been shot as well. Instead, the guard whacked Gogatz over the head with his rifle butt and walked away. I won the lottery, by the way, that day as well. I wouldn't be here talking to you. And I talk about Gogatz. Here's a very ordinary person, very ordinary man who did something that was considered extraordinary at that time, is he wouldn't be silent. He spoke up, he took action, and you all need to be like Gogatz. Not just because of what he did or the fact that 85 years later we're talking about him, in this case in Farmington Hills, Michigan. He could probably not find Michigan on a map back in the day. We're talking about this man. And then I put a slide up of my family at the time where my parents were both alive, and I point out my older brother, you know, the guy who diagrammed the whatever. Well, he was a pioneering bone marrow transplanter, okay, down at MD Anderson Hospital. No Gogots, no Dr. Leonard Horwitz. Our son Adam, who worked a summer, I believe, at the Jewish News back in the day, is on the faculty of the University of Michigan Medical School. In his research on AI, technology, wearables, focuses on how to predict and head off depression and suicide ideation. Okay? No Gogots, no Dr. Adam Horwitz. He may be saving people right here in this room because he focuses on teens and PTSD veterans. So that's really kind of the takeaway that I try. It isn't just, here's the story, but here are people who did extraordinary things, but they weren't necessarily extraordinary people. They're the right thing to do. I wouldn't be here if he didn't. And the lives that my brother and my son will either already have impacted or will impact are because of Gogots.
Arthur, my name is Michael Seltzer. I am
Hi, Mike.
I'm a media guy.
I know you
am yes, and I'm in awe of you. There have been a lot of great stories told about the Holocaust. Nikki's story, you know, the story about Sir Nicholas Winton and so on. And I have been involved in some documentary production myself. I'm a producer. I've done documentaries around famous media people like Dick Burton and Robin Seymour. So there is the possibility, and I would like to talk to you about that. But I currently have a TV series called The Franklin Show, and I would like to have you as a guest. I've done a number of Holocaust survivor stories on my show. I'm a Temple Israel board member. I had the rabbis on after the terrible incident at Temple Israel. So I would like to connect with you later and talk to you about an interview on the Franklin Show and talk to you about the potential of a documentary, because you've got wonderful stories to tell, and I would really like to follow up.
I think was there a question over here though earlier? Yes.
Gina told me to straighten my collar, so how's that, better?
It's not so much a question, just I wanted to thank you very much. I enjoyed the book immensely. I'm buying copies for friends to pass it on, buying one for my favorite librarian to pass it on. And a comment is that when you were mentioning about a lot of people not talking about growing up, some of what your mother said to you reminded me of what Art Spiegelman had written about his father. Like, oh, you think you're tired. This is what tired is. Oh, you think they're friends. This is what friends can do. But anyway, I just want to thank you very much, and I have a lot of admiration for you and your family.
I'm Frida Arlo, and I want to thank Arthur for doing this because he probably belongs to our group, which is the largest and oldest, maybe not largest, but certainly the oldest group in the whole world of second-generation children of Holocaust survivors. And we have strived over the years to keep these memories alive. And right now, we're in the process of organizing some people who will write stories. Again, the most important difference being about our impressions of growing up as both Americans and children of Holocaust survivors, and the impact that has been on us, our own trauma, and what we pass on to the third generation that's called the 3 Gs, and we're the 2 Gs. So it's so important because, as we know, we're getting older, and these memories will be lost forever if we don't preserve them. So we thank you, and we might consult you to help us write. At least we're thinking of an anthology.
Nice.
And there's a group in Ann Arbor who has done this.
I've seen it.
And we certainly need to preserve these memories, so we thank you.
I have to commend you for writing your book. And more people should be writing books like this so that the deniers and the people that don't understand what happened to the Jewish people will know more, and I commend you for that.
Okay, thanks, Linda.
Maybe the last one here then?
My name is Susanna Stoika. I'm a child of 2 Holocaust survivors. I have my own book with my story. We are sharing our stories. It's a kind of a passive thing in my view. How do we use our experience as children of survivors to bring peace to the world?
Wow.
I want to do something and I don't know what. How do you do that? How do you get outside the circle of teaching children of Jewish parents about what Holocaust means? Because there are many other Holocausts. We should do something with it.
There's no question that the lessons from the Holocaust and what role children of survivors can play in making sure that they can be magnified. And as I had mentioned with Gogot's just a moment ago, that the message, and overwhelmingly the students who come to the Zeckelman Holocaust Center who I speak to are not from, are not Jewish. But the overarching message is speak up, speak out. Okay, if you see something wrong, don't be a bystander. And the benefit of you doing that is something 85 years later, this guy Gogot's wouldn't know that because of what he did for my mother, that there are thousands of people whose lives were made better by, in my case, my brother, whose lives are being made better by my son. And if you just multiply that for survivors and their children and what they've done across so many things, but really, I think that's the message, is it only takes one. We hear about, one person can, change the world. And I think that's what we have to do. Otherwise, it's too overwhelming. It's got to be, can you change one at a time? And you may never see the dividend of what your message is, but it could be out there and have long-lasting impact. Thanks.
Arthur, thank you very much.